The name of the shiur tonight is Women, Mussaf, and the Machatzis HaShekel. Now, of course, the question is, what do these three things have in common? Aha. Okay, so that'll be our first clue. You'll see in just a moment. So first of all, the halacha having to do with Mussaf, and this is a very important halacha l'maisa that I want us all to take to heart and maybe communicate to the women in our families. The Shulchan Aruch writes, Nashim va'avadim afal pi sheptur mikriya shema chayovim b'tefillah, that even though women and Canaanite servants, which is a non sequitur in halacha today, but even though they're exempt from kriya shema, they're still obligated to pray on a daily basis. Now, why would they be exempt from kriya shema? Right? Mitnei shehi mitzvah saseh shelo azman grama. But the Mechaber says that prayer, petitioning God, is a non-time bound commandment. Okay, and then there's a mitzvah for ketanim as well to educate them in prayer. We'll do this lengthy Mishnah Berurah just to make sure that we are clear on this very, very important machlokes between the Rambam and the Ramban as to the nature of the mitzvah of tefillah. Mishnah Berurah says as follows. This is all in Siman Kufav, okay? He says, Kol ze l'das harambam shirak zmanei hatfilah hi medivrei sofrim aval ikar mitzvahs tefillah hi min haTorah. The Mechaber is going according to the Rambam, who says that the only thing that is rabbinically instituted regarding prayer is the time of the day that you're supposed to pray. But there is a biblical mitzvah to pray that is not time-bound. Okay? Right? So the famous Rambam says that when the Torah says, serve God with your hearts, what it means is to pray, because the only way, what kind of prayer, what kind of service do you do to God with your heart? It's prayer. So this is a biblical commandment, okay? Ella she'en la nusach yadua min haTorah, v'yachol hispalel b'chol nusach sheyirtzeh, u'b'chol eis sheyirtzeh. From a biblical standpoint, midioraisa, a person has a right to daven whatever words he wants, and at whatever time he wishes. Okay? And therefore, once a person davens once a day, it doesn't matter what he says and it doesn't matter when he says it, as long as he calls out to God from his heart, he has fulfilled the biblical mitzvah of tefillah. Now, accordingly, there should be no difference between men and women in this mitzvah. Understood? So far, so good? Very straightforward. V'kasav hamagin Avram, sha'al pi svarazu nahagu rov hanashim, she'ein mispalalim shmona esrei b'temidus, shachar ve'erev, lefi sha'omros miyad baboker samach l'netila eza bakasha, u'min haTorah yotzos bazeh, ve'efsher sha'av chachamim lo chiyavu yoser. So the Mishnah Berurah says, quoting the Magen Avram, that it is based upon this mitzvah deoraisa, that is nondescript, that women rely on this mitzvah, the nondescript nature of this mitzvah, and therefore they don't necessarily daven Shmona Esrei every day. Women who don't necessarily daven Shmona Esrei every day have what to rely upon. They can rely on this Rambam. Because according to this Rambam, biblically you fulfill your mitzvah by saying, rub-a-dub-dub, thanks for the grub. Or, I know that's a little bit too flippant, but thank you God for giving me another day of life, or please Hashem, grant me another day of life, or moda'ani lefanecha melachai b'kayam, right? Or whatever you want to say. But there doesn't have to be a specific nusach of Shmona Esrei brachas, right? So that's the reason why women don't have to daven Shmona Esrei according to this opinion. And says the Magen Avram, we don't necessarily know that the Chachamim obligated women any more than the basic biblical requirement. So if a woman doesn't wish to say officially the Shmona Esrei, she doesn't have to according to the Rambam. And then he says, Aval da'as haramban she'ikar mitzvahs tefillah midivrei sofrim. The Ramban says no. The Ramban says, I disagree. there is no mitzvah midioraisa of daily tefillah. And if you wanted to develop this Ramban further, you'd have to really go into it more in the original sources. The Ramban says the only time that there's a mitzvah saseh dioraisa of tefillah is be'ez tzara, that when you're in a time of distress, you're obligated to call out to Hashem. But the fact that there's this mitzvah on a daily basis, midioraisa of prayer, the Ramban doesn't agree with that. And therefore he says the whole mitzvah of daily prayer is midirabbanan. Shehem anshe knesses hagdola shetiknu shmona esrei brachos al haseder lihispalal osan shacharis umincha choiva va'arvis rishus. He says the anshe knesses hagdola originated this mitzvah of daily prayer twice daily, shacharis and mincha, as an obligation, and ma'ariv as an option. Okay, that was the original takana. V'afal pishu hu mitzvah saseh medivrei sofrim shehazman grama v'hanashim pituros michol mitzvah saseh shehazman grama afilu medivrei sofrim. And even though women are exempt from time-bound mitzvahs, including rabbinic time-bound mitzvahs, and therefore you should say that women are completely patur from this mitzvah, kagon kiddush halavana, like women are exempt from kiddush lavana, afal pichein chiyavu osam betfila shacharis umincha kamo anashim, ho'olu tefila hi bakashas rachamim. But nevertheless, when the rabbis instituted this mitzvah of davening, they included women. Why? Because part and parcel of the mitzvah of davening is the mitzvah of beseeching the Lord for compassion. Now, it's one thing to say that women are exempt from time-bound mitzvahs, but why would a woman be excluded from something which connects her and causes her to beseech the Almighty for compassion, for mercy? And therefore the rabbis didn't want to exclude women from prayer. And you see that there's a very important difference between the Ramban and the Rambam. According to the Ramban, since the rabbis are the originators of this takana, they were the very same rabbis who instituted daily prayer in the first place, and they were the same rabbis who said that women should participate in this daily mitzvah. And so therefore there is no difference between men and women, according to the Ramban, as far as their obligation for prayer, at least not for shacharis and mincha. V'chein ikar, and that is the primary halachic position. We don't paskin like the Rambam that exempts women from prayer. We primarily paskin like the Ramban, who says that a woman is obligated to daven shmona esrei, shacharis and mincha. Kichein das rov haposkim, v'chein yichriya b'sefer shagas aryeh. And he says most poskim hold this way. The shagas aryeh proves that that's how we paskin. Al kein yesh lahazhir l'nashim sheyispalalu shmona esrei. That's why you should exhort the women within the Jewish community that they should daven shmona esrei twice daily. V'nachon gam kein sheyikablu aleim ol malchu shemayim deyahainu sheyomru al kol panim shema Yisrael k'deisa b'simin ayin. And even though the Mechaber says that women are exempt from Kriya Shema midioraisa because it's a time-bound mitzvah, but there's an aspect of intellectual engagement that every human being every Jew should engage in, regardless of whether they're a man or a woman, to accept upon themselves the yoke of heaven. And even though we do that formally with the recital of Kriya Shema, women are exempt from the formal recitation, but they should say the Shema every day so that they accept the yoke of heaven upon themselves. Not because they're doing the mitzvah of Kriya Shema, which is specifically for men, but they're doing the mitzvah of Kabbalas o Malchus Shemayim, which is universal. Okay. And therefore, v'yomru gam kein birkas emes v'yatziv k'dei lismach gula l'tfila kamo shekasav amagin avram b'simen ayin, the simen ayin. And they should also say the brachas between Kriya Shema and Shmona Esrei, so that they have the advantage of having the bracha of Ga'al Yisrael immediately before Shmona Esrei, because there's no reason to differentiate between men and women in that respect either. V'chol ze le'inyan shacharis u'mincha, aval tfilas arvis shu rishus, apal pi shach shekvar kiblu aleim kol Yisrael l'chova, mikol makom hanashim lo kiblu aleim v'ruban ein mispalel in arvis. He says this, according to the Ramban, women therefore only have to daven Shmona Esrei, shacharis and mincha. However, there's no obligation for them to daven Ma'ariv. And the reason is because when the Anshe Knesses Hagdola originally instituted the mitzvah to daven, they only made it an obligation to daven twice a day, not 3 times a day. Eventually, with ensuing generations, the men obligated themselves voluntarily to daven a 3rd time, even though Ma'ariv was originally Rishus, but the men of the community upgraded it to an obligation. But the women never accepted that obligation. It's very difficult for a woman to go outside at night. Sometimes it's unsafe for a woman to go outside at night. And therefore there's no obligation at all for a woman to daven Ma'ariv. Then, and here's the kicker, so this was all to get to this last line for the purposes of our shiur tonight. Then he says, Utfilas Mussafin. Now what about the obligation for a woman to daven Mussaf? Now arguably, and ironically, the one tefillah that most women say over the course of the week is Mussaf on Shabbos. Right? But according to this whole argument, one could say that Mussaf is the least obligatory prayer for a woman to daven. It's not included in the daily obligatory prayers that were placed upon women because of beseeching of mercy. Mussaf is a commemoration of the sacrificial order that was brought on Shabbos. So it doesn't have that aspect of beseeching for mercy from God as the Shmona Esrei does. So one should argue that women should not have to daven Mussaf. So he says, B'tzlach kosav de peturos. B'tzlach writes that they're pater. Aval b'sefer mogen giborim kosav de chayavos ayin sham. We have a machlokus on the Achronim. Now we're going to discuss this machlokus to a larger extent, whether women are obligated to daven Mussaf or not. And here's we get to the interesting part of the story. There is, in the 19th century, a rabbi whose name is Harav Shol Hirsch Levin, whose father was a Chashav Rav from Germany, and he himself rose at an early age to scholarly prominence, and immediately, as a young man, embroiled himself in controversy. The first part of his life, he embroiled himself in controversy by writing a scathing attack against a well-known chief rabbi of another city. And he wrote it under a pseudonym so that no one should know who he was. It was later discovered, he was later exposed, the sefer was put into Cherem, and he was very much put to shame because of this. Shortly thereafter, he published another sefer. This sefer is called Bisamim Rosh. And Rav Levine said that he had been able to compile a series of Piskei Halacha from Rishonim, primarily from Rabbeinu Asher, the Rosh, who lives in the 13th century. Okay, so this is now, he's making a very, very, very important claim that 500 years later, he's been able to compile Piskei Halacha from the Rosh, and he added his own commentary called Kasa da Harsina, which he called fish hash, which is basically like, some cheap food that you add to the table when you don't have anything else to serve. It's a term used by the Gemara for the poor man's dinner. Okay? So he has Bisamim Rosh, which is from the Rosh, he says, and then he has his commentary called Kasa da Harsina. So we're going to read a psak from the Bisamim Rosh, which allegedly comes from the Rosh, and here it is. It's in source number 3. Bisamim Rosh in Siman Pei Tes says, V'nashim peturos mitfilas al-musafim. Women are exempt from davening Mussaf. By the way, he's living at the same time as the Tzlach, as Rabbi HaShekel Landau. So notice, and Rabbi HaShekel Landau was one of the people that put Rabbi Levine's first sefer into Cherem. And he says that women are exempt from davening Mussaf. Dezos hatfila ena ba'a ela mishum zecher l'chiyuv hakarbanos. He says, what's the reason? He says, Mussaf is a surrogate for the offering of the Karban Mussaf. The Karban Mussaf is a communal sacrifice. And he says, the Isha lo haisa shokeles. Women did not contribute to the communal sacrifices. How did they purchase communal sacrifices? Where did the funds come from? From the Machatzis HaShekel. The Torah tells us, and we're going to read about it in this week's Parsha, in Parsha Shkalim, that Kol ha'over al ha'pikudim mi ben esrim shana v'mala yitain trumas Hashem. That any male over the age of 20 is obligated to give the Machatzis HaShekel for the purchase of communal karbonos. At least that's the Ledoros. That's all future generations after the temple is built contribute for that purpose. Women do not contribute a Machatzis HaShekel. And argues the Rosh in Besamim Rosh that the reason why women have no chelek in the carbon Mussaf is they have no chelek in any communal carbon because they did not contribute. They don't have a portion in it. Ve'ein lahem chelek b'karbanos tibur, and therefore they don't have any portion in communal karbanos. Avol kfar nohagu liyispalel kol davar v'chivu es atzmam b'chol hamitzvos. But then the Rosh says, but they have such a minhag of doing so, and they've obligated themselves in all mitzvos, even those that they are not obligated to do. So the Besamim Rosh has no problem if they want to daven Mussaf. It's become the minhag that's become the common practice, but it's important to know that they're really not obligated to do so. And here's where we'll get a little bit into the biography of the Besamim Rosh.
Once that minhag takes place, do they then have a chiyuv?
It seems like once it becomes a chiyuv that all women do it, that all women accept it upon themselves, it does become a chiyuv. But here's the irony.
Community.
The irony
in that
is
community.
what?
In that community.
Well, in that community, right? And if all communities at one generation accept it, then all ensuing generations. The irony is that there's far less of a reason for a woman to daven Mussaf than there is for her to daven Shacharis and Mincha. And the irony is that that's the one tefillah that all women daven every week, is Mussaf Shabbos. And if you were to ask me, based on what we're going to be learning tonight, if my wife were to ask me, I come to shul at 10:30, they're already done with Shacharis, I only have time to daven one Amida, what should I do? I would tell her, daven Shacharis. Say Kriya Shema, say Shmona Esrei for Shacharis, and Mussaf, no. If that's all you have time, I would say Shacharis is far more important than Mussaf. This is from the Sfarim blog of over 10 years ago. I believe it's Mark Shapiro who's writing this. Louis Ginsburg wrote the original entry in the Jewish Encyclopedia for Rav Shaul Levin. And I want to read for you a portion of what he writes. In the previous post, I mentioned the new book. The Besamim Rosh is a book of responsa, first published in Berlin in 1793. It contained two parts: the Tshuvas and a commentary titled Kasa da Harsana. The person who published it, Rav Shaul Berlin, was the Berlin chief rabbi's son. Rav Shaul claimed the tshuva were from a manuscript which he attributed to the Rosh of Asher ben Yechiel. The commentary, Kasa da Harsana, was from Rav Shaul. Right after it appeared, there were some that doubted the authenticity of at least some of the tshuvas. They claimed that those tshuvas were not from the Rosh. There were many novel tshuvas. Among these was one permitting shaving on Chol HaMoed, permitting kitnias, and claiming kitnias was actually a Karaite custom and relaxing the restrictions on suicide. The first book to come out against the Besamim Rosh was written by Reb Zev Wolf, titled Ze'ev Yitrov, and was published that same year, 1793. In it, he takes issue with some of the tshuvos that are written in the Besamim Rosh. He also claims that Reb Shaul retracted one, the tshuva permitting shaving on Chol HaMoed. However, it is unclear whether Reb Shaul admitted it was a forgery or he retracted it in a less sensational manner. After this book, there were numerous others who doubted either the entirety or at least portions of the book. However, Reb Shaul's father, Reb Tzvi Hirsch Levin of Berlin, defended the work of his son and vouched for the authenticity of it. Ginsburg states that the father only did it because he was so embarrassed and humiliated because of his son's forgery, and that his son clearly was an unstable person. There were others who supported the book. It appears that Reb Yosef Chaim David Azulai the Chida also vouched for it based upon Reb Tzvi Hirsch's testimony. Reb Shaul actually had a history that may explain why some were suspect of him. He published under a pseudonym a book titled Mitzveh Yekusiel, which attacked Reb Paul Hamburg, the chief rabbi of Altona. Hamburg, Wandsbek. This book was put in Chera and burned in some cities, as I mentioned to you before. So, as mentioned above, the Besamim Rosh was first published in 1793. However, it was not republished until 1881, nearly 100 years later. By the way, the author, Rav Shaul ben Tzvi Hirsch Levin, dies a year after the publication of the Besamim Rosh. He's humiliated, goes into exile, and then dies as a young man. He died at the age of 54. So clearly, there was something unstable about him. Ginsburg tries to explain what was going on with this fellow. Why would it that a great Talmud Chacham, a great Talmudist, would forge certain things and claim that they were done in the name of somebody else? And by the way, this is not the only rabbinic personality who's done this. It's a rarity, but nevertheless, we find that it's done in different stages. Probably a great book to be, great Jewish forgeries would be a great research book, great doctoral thesis. Ginsburg writes in the Jewish Encyclopedia, he says, to understand this unique personality, note that as a modern historian remarks, that Berlin was a focal point for the rays of a sinking and rising period in Jewish history. Being a great Talmudist, he knew better how to attack rabbinism, meaning this rising rabbinic community that was very, very focused on minutia and being machmir in certain areas. And he was filled with a burning desire to lead his people toward intellectual freedom. Mendelssohn's and Wesley's timid attempts to inaugurate a new era did not appeal to him. With his youthful ardor, he could not understand that the development of the popular consciousness is a slow process. An open championship of his ideas, however, would have meant a breach with his father, wife, and children, in short, with all his associates, it being, after all, doubtful whether his sacrifices would have helped his cause. His anonymous and pseudonymous authorship was a measure of policy and not of cowardice. He could not, however, escape the consequences of such a mode of warfare. It is debasing and embittering to attack secretly those whom one is forced to praise in public. Hence, Berlin became personal in his polemics and nervous and dissatisfied with himself and the world because he knew he was misunderstood through his own fault. This is a very interesting psychological analysis. Whether Ginsburg is correct is pure speculation, and it's a very speculative commentary. The point that I want to raise is that the Sefer Besamim Rosh is highly problematic, and this psak halacha may have been made up by Levin and may have no validity whatsoever. And if that were the case, and if no one else would have cited it, we would not really even bother with it in a shir at all. If this was the only source for saying that because women are patur from the mitzvah of Machatzis HaShekel, and because they have no portion in the communal karbanos, they are patur from Tfilas Mussaf, we would say, Shalom al Yisrael, that's Besamim Rosh, we don't reckon with it. But now comes along Rabbi Akiva Eger, who is just living just a few short years, or is really a contemporary of the Besamim Rosh. And he says the same thing, quoting the Besamim Rosh. So you see, it's a very complicated situation. It's not like everyone rejected the Sefer. Rabbi Akiva Eger uses the Sefer thinking that at least portions of it are authentic. And so, if you notice, we'll just skip to source number 5. Rabbi Akiva Eger says it both in his Tshuvas, but also in his gloss on Shulchan Aruch. He says, in commenting on the Magen Avram, which we quoted from in the Mishnah Berurah, who says that there's a machlokas between the Rambam and the Ramban whether the mitzvah of daily prayer is midioraisa or midorabanan. The Rabbi Akiva Eger in source number 5 quotes the Tshuvas Besamim Rosh Siman Peites, Denashim Peturos Mitfilas Musafim De'ena Ba Ela Lizkor Chiyuv Karbanos Ve'isha Lo Haisa Shokeles. So he quotes exactly what the Besamim Rosh had said, that because the Tfilas Mussaf is commemorative of the Karban Mussaf, and women had no portion in the Karban Mussaf, Ve'en Lo Chelek B'Karbanos Sibur. Ela Tikvar Nagu Li'Hispal Kol Davar, V'Chiyuv Atzma B'Chol HaMitzvos, exactly as the Besamim Rosh had decided. And then he says, Gam B'Chidushay Tzlach, Reish Pei Daled, or Reish Perek Daled de Brachos, Kosav Denashim Peturin Mitfilas Musaf, Nitam Dohavizman Grama Ayin Sham. The Tzlach also states that women are exempt from the mitzvah of tfilas Mussaf, because that for sure is a mitzvah saseh shahazman grama. And there is no aspect, what he doesn't include from the tzlach, but what is implicit, is that at least with other prayers, why did the Magen Avram say that even though there's time-bound status to other prayers, women should still pray them? Because the prayer is structured for the purpose of invoking mercy from Hashem. And why should only a man ask Hashem for mercy and not a woman? But when you look at the prayer of Mussaf, there's no aspect of supplication in Mussaf. All you have is an affirmation of the offering of the korban. There's no rachami in that prayer. And therefore there's no reason for women to be obligated to daven it, neither because of their participation in the korban Mussaf, nor is there any aspect of supplication in the prayer of Mussaf either. And that's the reason why women, according to Rabbi Yecheskel Landau as well, are patur from davening Mussaf. Okay, let us go on.
Where is the Inyan of Rachamim Shacharit on Shabbos?
It doesn't exist there either. But at least Shacharis as an institution, during the rest of the week, contains Rachamim, contains a supplicative aspect to it. And therefore, one could argue that since a woman davens Shacharis on a daily basis, she should daven Shacharis on Shabbos morning as well. It's an excellent point, Chuck. And by the way, you'll see an extension of that argument that's made by the Mogen Giborim, who is a late Acharon, that's cited quite often by the Mishnah Berurah. He lives in the 19th century. And the Mogen Giborim wants to argue against the Tzlach and against the Besamim Rosh. He really only quotes the Tzlach. As you'll see in a minute, he's aware of the Sefer Besamim Rosh, but he doesn't have a copy of it. So it's not a very widespread sefer either, probably because it was attacked very early on. If you notice, the Magen Giborim writes as follows. It's in source number 6. I apologize for the poor quality of the font. He says, "Ule'inyan tfilas hamusafim im nashim chayavos." I'm not sure what that word is. Hatzlach kosav b'pshitus reish pei dalid, reish perik dalid de'eno noheg b'nashim. The Tzlach says, he states it as a given, that women are not davening Mussaf. Mishum dahava mitzvah saseh shahazman grama, because it's a time-bound positive mitzvah. V'rachamim lo shayach b'tfilas Mussaf, she'ena rachamim, kemo shekosov harav Rabbeinu Yona, le'inyan tashlumin, delakach ein lo tashlumin. He says, the Rabbeinu Yona in Maseches Bracha says, that for every other prayer, if you are not able to daven Shacharis, for example, what do we know about that? What do we know? What are you supposed to do if you miss Shacharis one day, because of not because of negligence, but because of Einus? So there's a din called Tashlumin. You daven 2 Shmona Esrei at Mincha, right? Now, what if you are unable to daven Mussaf? Is there any Tashlumin for Mussaf? No, there's no Tashlumin for Mussaf, says Rabbeinu Yona, because the only time that we give you a makeup for prayer is when that prayer is supplicative in nature. We want to give you the opportunity to supplicate before God. But if there's no supplicative nature to that prayer, then there's no reason to give you a makeup. You missed out, like Avar Zmano, Batal Karbano. If the time of Mussaf is already elapsed, you can't bring the carbon. There's no remnant to allow for a makeup in that situation. And you see, therefore, very starkly, that there is no aspect of rachamim, of supplication, involved in tfilas Mussaf. And therefore, since it's a time-bound mitzvah, there's no aspect of rachamim, there's no reason why a woman should daven Mussaf. He says like this. He says, "The lakach utfila shacharis b'shabbosos v'yomim tovim shiny sheniskenu keneged tfilas chol." He says, what about Chuck's question, which was, is there any aspect of rachamim in the Shabbos Shacharis or Mincha? And to which the answer is no. Admittedly, there's not. But there, you could argue that the 7 brachas that we say in the Shacharis Amida on Shabbos is really a substitute for the normative Shmona Esrei, which does contain supplication. Ayin Sham. That's what Rabbeinu Yonah says. Ulafi ani esdaiti. Kaven denira meha Yerushalmi shahayu nohagin lihisbalel gam b'mussaf Shmona Esrei brachos. He says like this. He says, I would respectfully disagree with the tzlach. Because you see that the Gemara Yerushalmi says that at one point in history, there was a minhag not only to daven on Shabbos, Shacharis, Shmona Esrei Brachos, there was even a minhag at one time to daven Shmona Esrei Brachos, even at Mussaf, not to have a separate Amida, but to use the same text that we have for every day, just to do it again at Mussaf. Kemo shekasav harayvet v'harosh v'harashba v'perek gimel. Ulakach l'daitam im hispalo Shmona Esrei b'Mussaf Shabbos v'hizkir ba me'ein Mussafi hayom yatsa. He says that's the reason why they paskin that if, let's say, a person really got fardreit and he, instead of davening Mussaf, he said Shmona Esrei at Mussaf on Shabbos, as long as he mentioned that this is for the Korban Mussaf, and he said V'yom HaShabbos Shnei Chvasim B'nei Shana Timim, he says that one little paragraph, and everything else is regular Vachdik Shmona Esrei, he's Yotzei B'di'evet, because Mimela Haya Az Bizman Hahu B'chiyuv Gomer Kevin Shahayu Rachamim. So he says, therefore you see, Uladivrehem rather, Mimela Haya Az Bizman Hahu B'chiyuv Gomer. Therefore you see that Shmona Esrei was obligatory for Mussaf at one time historically, and if Mussaf at one time historically involved Rachamim, even though now it does not, it should be no different from Shacharis, where during the week it has Rachamim. On Shabbos, we substitute the Rachamim aspect with just 7 blessings, but that's what we're doing for Mussaf as well. And therefore, he says, Uvameh nifsak chiyuvayu. And therefore, how could that obligation of women that were originally mandated to daven Mussaf, how could that obligation now be removed? It's one thing to say that the nusach has changed, but to say that now women are excluded from something that they were originally obligated to do because there was an aspect originally, historically, of Rachamim to Mussaf, therefore the Magen Giborim says it would seem to me that women should daven Mussaf as well. They should be obligated to daven Mussaf, because historically Mussaf used to be a full Shmona Esrei. And since there was never any point where the rabbis rescinded the scope of individuals who were obligated to daven Mussaf, so therefore the people who are obligated to daven Mussaf, even though the nusach has changed, that scope of people remains. And that's why women are obligated to daven. So you can go through the rest of the Magen Giborim yourself, but it's on that basis that he paskins that women are obligated to daven Mussaf. Now, I want to go a little bit further, because we still have to make sense of this Besamim Rosh, which is now quoted by Rabbi Akiva Eger, who now takes it very seriously. We have to see the association between Machatzis, HaShekel, Karbanos Tzibor, and Mussaf. Okay, let's go a little bit further. Again, as I mentioned to you, that it becomes clear from the Mishnah Berurah that there is a machlokes whether women have an obligation to daven Mussaf or not. Everyone agrees that women have an obligation to daven Shacharis. At least that's the final psak of the Mishnah Berurah. That being the case, it would seem to me, I'll mention it again, that if your wife comes late Shabbos morning and she can only has time to daven one Amida, she should really be davening the Shacharis instead of Mussaf, even if everyone else is davening Mussaf. Now let's go a little bit further. In Siman Reish Tzadi Vav, which talks about the laws of Havdalah, it says, very interestingly, the Mechaber says, Nashim chayavos b'Havdalah kishem shechayavos b'Kiddush, that women are obligated in Havdalah, just like they're obligated in Kiddush. And the Ramah says, Al kain lo yavdilu la'atzmani rak yishmu Havdalah min ha'anashim. It is for that reason, and this deserves its own Sugya Shiur, the whole din of women in Havdalah, but this is the reason why women should preferably hear Havdalah from a man and not make Havdalah on their own, because there's a whole question whether women are obligated in Havdalah in the first place. Now, why is there a question whether women are obligated in Havdalah in the first place or not? So comes along the Magen Avram, and he says, Ubach Kosa, first he quotes the Bach, who says, "Afilu laman da'omer shepeturos mikol makom yicholun lahavdil la'atzman kamo b'shofar v'lulav." He says, even if you hold that women are exempt from Havdalah, they certainly can, if they're on their own, make their own bracha, just like by shofar and lulav, where we know clearly that it's a mitzvah saseh shahazman grama, and women are exempt. They can still make a bracha on shofar and blow the shofar. They can make a mitzvah on the lulav and shake the lulav in esrog. It's perfectly fine. The Bach goes even further. And he says, and therefore, even if there are men that they can listen to Havdalah from, they don't have to. If they want to, just like a woman doesn't have to be Yotzei with someone else's Tekiah Shofar if she doesn't want to. She doesn't have to be Yotzei with her husband's Havdalah if she doesn't want to. But the Magen Avram takes issue with the Bach. He says, Ve'efshir das Rama b'mitzvah sheyesh ba'asiyah rishoyim lasos ulevarech. Aval b'davar she'en ba ela habracha kagon kan ein rishos. Ve'efshir demehai taima lo nahagu l'kadesh halavana. So the Magen Avram tells us a very big chiddush, and he tells us like this, and where he gets it from it's not clear. This requires further research. But the Magen Avram says a big chiddush, and he says that it could be that the whole heter for a woman to make a bracha on a mitzvah saseh shahazman grama, even though she's exempt, is when the mitzvah involves a physical action after the making of the bracha. But what if the bracha itself is the mitzvah? What if the bracha itself is the mitzvah? Says the Magen Avram, it's altogether possible that the Ramah holds that when the bracha itself is the mitzvah, and a woman is exempt from that mitzvah, she should not make that bracha. We only allow a woman to obligate herself to a maisa mitzvah, and once she's allowed to obligate herself to shaking a lulav, she can be mevarech before. But if the mitzvah that she's obligated, that she's performing, is the recitation of the bracha, and she's patur from that mitzvah, the Ramah may hold, says the Magen Avram, that she should not make that bracha on her own. And that would be the difference between Havdalah and Tekiah Shofar, between Havdalah and shaking a lulav. And that's why he says, that's why women don't do Kiddush Levana. He says that could be the reason, because, by the way, the Shalah HaKadosh gives another reason why women don't do Kiddush Levana, because it involves the Chet of Adam Harishon, which women participated in. But the Magen Avram gives a halacha svara, that the reason why women do not say Kiddush Levana is for this very reason, that the mitzvah is the bracha itself. There is no Maisa HaMitzvah. The mitzvah itself is the bracha, and therefore women should not do it independently because they're patur. Now, the reason why I provide you with this information, go ahead.
If you hold that Birkat HaMazon is the women are patur from Birkat HaMazon, according to some Vandamri, they should be able to say the Birkat HaMazon for themselves. Isn't Birkat HaMazon the bracha is the mitzvah?
The bracha itself is the mitzvah.
So let's say women are patur from Birkat HaMazon.
Because of bris va'aretz, is that the reason why? I forget all of the things, right?
But it's the opinion that the women are patur from
right. So according to this svara, if they're patur, they shouldn't. We don't paskin that way, right? The reason why I bring this in is because of a fascinating shuv of the Maram Shik. He lives in the 19th century. The Maram Shik, as you know, many of you know, is a talmid of the Chassam Sofer, an ardent opponent of the Haskalah, the Reformation movement, and he's got a lot of very important tshuvas. Comes along the Maram Shik, and we're taking only the latter half of the tshuva. He was answering 3 questions from someone who was asking him about the bracha of Birkas HaChama, which was happening on a 28-year cycle, and it was coming up. And the questioner had 3 questions about Birkas HaChama, and the third question that he asked was, why don't women participate in Birkas HaChama? That was his question, okay? So listen, it's very interesting, you know. Okay, so first of all, he says, Bala Shlishis, my time anoshim ein mevorchen. He says, Kvar heirim moran zatzal b'chasam soifer, chelok orachaim simen vav, v'kosav denagu shelo levarich. He says that the minhag is for women not to do Birkas HaChama. Al pi Magen Avram sof simen reish tzadi vav. I think maybe it should be Ayin Sham Hatam. He says that the Magen Avram's reasoning why women should not do Kiddush Levana, and should not make Havdalah applies to Birkas Hachama as well, where the mitzvah is the bracha, therefore women should not make it. Uvelav hachi. Then he says, but even without that argument, nira, and please do not repeat this over to your wives. He says, Kevin shehu taloi b'chishuv tekufos umazolos. He says, Birkas Hachama is a mitzvah that is dependent upon making calculations in astronomy, astronomical calculations. Delamdu chachamim zal hamitzvah mei ushmartem ki hu chochmaschem. As our sages say, that where the Torah says, ki hu chochmaschem uvinaschem le'enei ha'amim. The Torah is your wisdom and understanding in the eyes of the other nations. And when they see that how expert you are in mathematical and astronomical calculations, they'll have great admiration for you. He says, ve'ein chachma le'isha. And of course, this is well beyond a woman's capacity to be able to understand astronomy and mathematics. So of course, he says, Gam einav v'mitzvah delimadu shmartem hi mishnah v'asi shapir. He says, and therefore, first of all, women have cannot be included in this mitzvah because they're incapable of doing astronomical calculations. He never met a woman astrophysicist, I guess. And second of all, they're not included in the mitzvah of Ushmartem, of Talmud Torah. And since the mitzvah of Birkas Hachama has an element of Talmud Torah because it involves calculations and study, in-depth study, therefore women are exempt for that reason as well. And therefore not only are exempt because it's a mitzvah saseh she'azman grama, but should not make the bracha, because they won't have the intellectual appreciation for the bracha. Okay? That's just an interesting facet of some bygone era where women were completely uneducated. Okay, that's fine. We don't have a problem with that. But he says, Uve'emes divrei hamagin Havram hanal kashimli. But he says, I have to tell you something. He says, the words of the Magen Avram are a bit problematic for me. He says, the imkain lama nashim mispalal in Mussaf. He says, why then do women daven Mussaf? He says, he says, after all, women are not obligated. First of all, according to the Magen Avram, what right does a woman have to daven Mussaf? The mitzvah of Mussaf itself is itself the mitzvah. And if you're telling me that any mitzvah that a woman is exempt from, which is the recitation of the bracha, she should not say, why then do women daven Mussaf? Secondarily, he says, women have no portion in the Korban Tamid or in the Korban Mussaf. He says, and that's why they don't have to give the Machatzis HaShekel. He says, and the Gemara in Brachos, which says that it's a given that women have to pray, he says, he says, why is it so pashut? If, according to the opinion that the rabbis instituted tefillah, shacharis, and mincha to correspond to the Korban Tamid, it's a surrogate for the Korban Tamid. If a woman has no portion in the communal Korban Tamid, why then she should be obligated in prayer? He says, "V'ikala meimar dahakushya al tefillah echa sheharambam kasav shumina Torah." He says it could be that that the question is predicated on the fact that it's a given that women have to pray at least once a day, like the Rambam says. Miu leperush ha'toisvos dal gimel tefillas koi v'afagav the mitzvah saseh she'azman gram anashim peturos afilo hachi kevin derachmin inu chayav v'zeh shayach b'shar tefillos. He says, but we can explain like Tosfos as well. Tosfos says that the Gemara's assumption that it's a given that women are obligated to pray is because tefillah, even if it's corresponding to the daily karbanos, is also instituted for supplication purposes, and that's something that a woman should do, that the rabbis wanted women to do, as we've saw before from the Magen Giborim and from others. He says, "Aval tefillas musaf delav rachami ela mishum u'neshal mafarim k'isa b'sim kovches b'magen avram sivkat and vav in kei nashim peturos." But musaf, says the Maram Shik, doesn't make any sense why women should have to daven Mussaf, like the Tzlach had argued, right? The kasha eich nashim mispalim hari kaimelan barachayim simin kuv zayin de'in mispalim b'yom tov v'shabbos tfilas nedava. He says, and here's my problem, and here's the kicker. He says, not only should women be exempt from davening Mussaf, but we establish in Siman Kuv Zayin that on Shabbos, you're not supposed to offer any non-obligatory prayers. Any prayers that are purely supplicatory in nature and are non-obligatory. He says, so then if that's the case, what right do women have to daven Mussaf if they're pater? The kol shekain tfilas Mussaf, etzarch ian ka'es divrei yedido, hakadosh Moshe shik, mi brezova. So this is, he says, basically I don't have an answer for this question. Now, if you look at Rav Vosner, who was a 20th, Zichron Livracha, who was a 20th century posek, said in source number 10, we're not going to have an opportunity to go through another very important shuva. He says, V'divrei hagon maram shik temuam etzli. He says, I don't understand the maram shik. He says, Dema shehiksha mitfilas nedava sheina b'shabbos adifa minei yochol ha'akshos. The tfilas musaf lo shayach b'nedava. Gam b'chol, kemo shekosav Baruch Chaim sham. He says, why didn't the Maram Shik ask an even more basic question? A person is never allowed to voluntarily daven Mussaf. If you've already davened Shacharis, there's an opinion that you can daven a second Shacharis. But no one holds that if you've already davened Mussaf, you can daven a second Mussaf. So you see that there's no such thing as a voluntary Mussaf. What right does a woman have to daven Mussaf ever if you're not allowed to daven a voluntary Mussaf? Aval be'emes ein ze inyan l'tfilas nedava. So the answer is, says Rav Vosner, he says that's a basic mistake. He says because there's no connection between the law of tfilas nedava to what women are doing when they're davening Mussaf. He says the mashim mekaymen hanoshim lasos ulevarich b'mitzvahs aseh she'azman grama eino b'toras nedava ela deshavya alayhu choiva keilu hayu mitzuvin vehem rotzos l'kayim ba'atzman masha anoshim mitzuvin. He lays down a very important yesod. When a woman obligates herself and volunteers to shake that lulav or to blow that shofar, what she's essentially saying is, it's not that I'm voluntarily blowing the shofar. I wish to place myself in the same realm as a man to obligate myself to blow shofar. I voluntarily obligate myself is the way it works. So it's not a voluntary prayer. It is a voluntary action to obligate myself to pray. And that's a fundamental difference. And therefore, when a woman commits herself to daven Mussaf, she is committing herself voluntarily to daven an obligatory prayer, placing herself on the same plane as her husband, or as her counterpart male. V'ayin Magen Avram Siman Tov Peites Sof Sivkat Nun Aleph. In kain he mispalalim Mussaf kehamechuyev lihispalal delo nedava kiblo alayu lechova kiblo alayu uvaosa darga he mispalalim. And therefore he says that Maram Shik's question is not really a question. He says because at the end of the day, when a woman davens Mussaf, she's not davening Mussaf as a tfilas nedava. She's davening Mussaf as a tfilas choiva. She's voluntarily making it obligatory upon herself, and that's what the right she has to daven Mussaf. And then finally, he just asks a bomb kasha. He says, this Magen Avram that the Maram Shik made reference to, he says, I don't understand. Hamaskanas Magen Avram sham degam bracha utfila greda beli maisa shayach ben Hashem kasher hochiach midivrei harosh Yehuyan Shams. He says, the Magen Avram's conclusion is that even a mitzvah that is a woman is exempt from, even if the mitzvah is the bracha, the Magen Avram is able to demonstrate that a woman can do that mitzvah and can make a bracha. So, granted, the Magen Avram entertains that as a possibility, but halacha l'maisa, the Magen Avram admits that a woman can make a bracha that she's exempt from making, even if the bracha itself is the fulfillment of the mitzvah. In any event, we're not going to have a chance to see the tshuva from Harav Yechiel Heller, who himself was a great Gaon in the 19th century, and would have been even more famous had he not died tragically at a young age. But he was extremely prolific, he was brilliant in the tshuvas that he wrote, and in the tshuvas Amudei Or, he tries to explain also this whole issue of whether women have this obligation to daven Mussaf or not. And he wants to argue that this whole argument by the Besamim Rosh and Rabbi Akiva Eger, that since women do not donate the Machatzis HaShekel, they don't have a chelek in the Karbanos Tzibor, is a false premise. He says, because it may be true that women are patur from the Machatzis HaShekel, but how can you suggest that women have no chelak in the Karbanos Tzibur? It's true, they don't have to pay for it. But every single Jew needs the benefits of Karbanos Tzibur. The Karban Tamid is brought to atone for communal sins and for sinful thoughts. How can you say that a woman doesn't need that? And he goes through demonstrating this with proofs to show that women do have a chelik in Karbanos Tzibur. And once you know that women have a chelik in Karbanos Tzibur, then for sure a woman not only can, but should daven Mussaf, because she too is a participant in the Karban Tzibur of the Karban Mussaf. And I just want to add one final thing. The Ben Ish Chai, not the Ben Ish Chai, the Kaf HaChaim comments on this halacha that is brought down in the Shulchan Aruch about the Machatzis HaShekel. And this will also help us appreciate why women should daven Mussaf as well. Because even though women are exempt from the Machatzis HaShekel, can a woman give the Machatzis HaShekel if she wants to? So the Mishnah in Masechet Shkalim states that of course a woman can. If you take a look in source number 17, the Mishnah in Masechet Shkalim says, Afal pi sha'amru, ein memashkenin nashim v'abonim uketanim, im shaklu mekablu miyadan. That if a woman wants to give the Machatzis HaShekel, we accept it. We don't force them to give. They're not obligated to give. But if a woman wants to, as to be a voluntary participant in the Machatzis HaShekel, we certainly accept it from them. And the Magen Avram even points out that even the modern day mitzvah of Machatzis HaShekel women are exempt from. As a matter of fact, you can be medayik that from the Mishnah Berurah, that even Bisman Hazeh, a woman does not have to participate in the Machatzis HaShekel. Now, how do we know that? Because even when you look in the language of the Shulchan Aruch, he just says that even though the Torah requires only men over the age of 20, our minhag is to take children over the age of 13. And not only over the age of 13, but even younger than that. Even ubarim shebimei iman. Even fetuses in their mother's womb should give the Machatzis, should have the Machatzis HaShekel given for them. But nowhere is it brought in the Shulchan Aruch that women should give the Machatzis HaShekel. So there's a dispute as to whether a woman should give Machatzis HaShekel, which is a zecher to what was done in the Beis HaMikdash today. The minhag, I believe, for most people is that women do give Machatzis HaShekel, and so therefore, when you're giving Machatzis HaShekel for the members of your family, you count off every single person in your family, including the men and the women and the daughters as well. That's the minhag. But comes along the Kaf HaChaim in source number 18, and he says as follows. He says, "Ve'en chayiv litno rakshu mi ben esrim v'chulei." He says there's no obligation to give the modern day Machatzis HaShekel unless you're 20 years old. Zeu l'das harav Ovadia bar Tanura b'masechet Shkalim perak aleph. Aval ha'tosfos yantiv sham kasav she haposkim cholkim u'svirlu deben yud gimel chay b'nashim peturos yuyin sham. Tosfos yantiv over there says that if once you're 13 you should. But even then they hold that women are exempt. Uvahagos maimoni kasav denashim v'yeladim chayovim v'lo yadati min olei. That's the Magen Avram. And the Magen Avram quotes the Hagos Maimon. He says that women are obligated, and even children under the age of bar mitzvah are obligated. And the Magen Avram says, I don't know where this comes from. So it says the Kaf HaChaim as follows. He says, V'nira mishum d'chsiv b'shkolim l'chaper al nafsho seichem. The whole mitzvah of Machatzis HaShekel is to atone for your souls. V'alkei nostim gam ba'ad hanashim v'yeladim k'dei l'chaper al hanefesh. So why give the Machatzis HaShekel for people who are not obligated? To create a soul atonement, right? It's the same idea that the Amudei Or of Rav Heller had tried to argue as to why women have a chelik in Karbanos Tzibur. They need atonement as well. He says that's why the Mishnah says that if they want to give, they can give. He says, and certainly nowadays, that the money goes for tzedakah, then surely this creates a kaparas nefesh, it creates an atonement. So obviously there is a spiritual benefit for women also to give the Machatzis HaShekel. Granted, they're not obligated to give, mi'ikar hadin, but if the minhag is for women to give so that they can have a kaparas nefesh, then it's a proper minhag and it should be instituted. And so therefore, in the final analysis, women, according to many poskim, are patur from davening Mussaf. According to the Maram Shik, they wouldn't even be allowed to daven Mussaf on Shabbos. Thankfully, the Maram Shik that argument is not accepted because he himself is not clear on why women daven Mussaf. And we've seen from various poskim who argue with that women are obligated in Mussaf, even when they're patur from the Machatzis HaShekel. And as Rav Heller writes, the reason why they're obligated in Mussaf is because they too need the benefits of the daily karbanos, including the korban Mussaf. So there's no reason why they shouldn't daven Mussaf. And as relates to the Machatzis HaShekel, even though women do not participate in the donation of the Machatzis HaShekel, that does not mean that they don't have a portion in the karbanos tzibur. Furthermore, as it relates to Machatzis HaShekel, it's true, women are patur. But it seems that from the Hagos Maimoni, even though the Magen Avram equivocates and is not clear where that source comes from, according to the Kaf HaChaim, it's extremely beneficial for every single member of your family to give the Machatzis HaShekel, and therefore it's certainly recommended, even though one could certainly absolve themselves from the Machatzis HaShekel as a woman or a child under bar mitzvah, because the poskim are not sure where that obligation comes from. Nevertheless, it's certainly beneficial to be machmir and for every family member to give the Machatzis HaShekel, which will go to be a mechaper al nafsho seichem, because it's going to go to tzedakah.